Learn the most advanced recruiting techniques. Land the most desirable talent. Launch your company towards massive success. This is the Higher Power Radio Show with Rick Girard.
And we are on take two. Ineffective communicators can shut down an audience in seconds, especially with nervous, outdated, or too technical presentation styles. This translates throughout your business and can definitely kill your ability to raise funding and hire top talent. I'm Rick Girard, and welcome to the Higher Power Radio Show. Our mission is to discuss and deconstruct insights from top-performing entrepreneurs, industry experts. Every week, we uncover tested tactical solutions to solve your company's toughest hiring challenges. Today, our guest is Stephanie Paul, speaker, expert communications trainer, and CEO of Stephanie Paul, Inc. Stephanie has an expertise in working with people who have significant message that needs to be inspirationally transferred to a variety of audiences, helping clients get away from selling to more storytelling and turning facts into edutainment. All this in a professional, entertaining, funny, and unique style of coaching. Her clients have fun while being coached and ultimately learning how to communicate on a deeper, more connected, and entertaining level. Bringing a new, refreshing air to the culture of the traditional corporate boardroom. And that's like,
ladies and gentlemen, we can tell that he's reading this. He's certainly not memorized, and he did not practice.
Ouch, I did. Yeah, how about the snafu? Ooh. So she's also a executive producer and co-organizer of TEDx, Mission Viejo. Stephanie, welcome to the Higher Power Radio Show today.
Well, thank you so much, Rick Girard.
It's awesome to have you.
It's exciting to be here.
I know, wow. So we want to, we're going to jump right into it. Things I want to cover is what is effective communication and why is it important to communicate your message, and how to craft an effective presentation for companies, for executives.
That's a lot. Can we start with the first question?
Let's start with the first one. Okay, so let's start with the why.
Why? What?
Why do I need to effectively communicate?
I think it's really important to be able to effectively communicate because people stop listening, especially now. Our time frame of being focused and engaged is much shorter than it used to be.
Sure.
With technology and everything, our brains shut off a lot quicker. They want interaction. They want to be stimulated. They want to move around. So if you're not communicating effectively, you literally shut people off, and they'll pick up their phone. They'll start thinking about what they're going to have for dinner. They'll start looking at your shoes and saying, "Oh, I don't like that guy's shoes." So it's true though. It's absolutely true. Our minds drift unless you use certain techniques that stimulate the brain in certain areas, and you have changes so you switch it up a little bit because that's the neuroscience behind it.
Absolutely. Okay. So where do we need to start in order to be an effective communicator?
I think to be an effective communicator, you have to start with listening.
Absolutely.
Mm.
I try to. We have two ears and one mouth, and you should use it in that proportion.
Yes, that's very good.
I just learned
Did you learn that in school? Oh, you just learned that now?
No, I Googled it earlier today.
GTS, that is fantastic.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So you need to be an effective listener.
Yeah, well, 93% of how we communicate is nonverbal.
Sure.
And so if it's nonverbal, that means if you're not listening to your audience, because essentially, regardless of whether it's one person or 1,000 people, when it's live, obviously when it's on camera, you can't see your audience because they're behind a lens.
Sure.
But if you're not listening to your audience and watching them, you're not going to see how they're communicating back to you. Therefore, it's essentially a conversation, even when you're presenting. If you don't include them and interact with them in some way, obviously you've got a message you need to get across, you've got some form of information, but if you're not listening to them, your audience will actually tell you where they want you to go and what information you can tell when they're bored. They will,
absolutely.
So if you're not seeing when they're bored, or you're not seeing when they switch off, or you're not allowing them to laugh when they think something's funny and communicating with that.
And you're just blowing past it and not letting them soak in the moment.
Well, also then they don't feel like you're really talking to them.
Sure.
It doesn't matter whether you're speaking to one person or 100 people. You should always consider it as if you're having an intimate conversation and you're trying to affect one person, and speak to that person, to their heart, their mind, their emotions, their needs and their desires, because ultimately, what's in it for them, right?
Yeah, yeah. That's This is great timing, by the way, for me, since I actually have a big presentation tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, so you need to be connected to the audience. So how do you actually listen when you're giving a talk or when you're giving a presentation?
I think it's in the same way that
on-
you do if you think about it as a conversation.
Yeah.
If you don't have a specific agenda, because an agenda usually means an underlying something that you're not sharing, right?
Like a takeaway.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if you actually, it's like you share some information, you watch how people react to it,
Mhm.
and then you react to their reaction, so to speak.
Yeah.
It's like it moves,
Sure.
It's a conversation. So if you think about it, okay, let's look at it from the perspective of two actors in
Yeah.
a scene. One actor does his line and listens to the behavior of the other actor, and then the other actor delivers and it's a behavioral exchange
Yes.
with acting,
Yeah.
right? So it's the same thing with a communication with an audience. It's a behavioral exchange. When you truly are listening to them, you can fire on all cylinders, still deliver your message, and the thing, you affect them emotionally, right?
Sure.
So when they're emotionally charged in the same way that you're passionate about whatever it is that you're sharing, then they're more likely to remember what it is you're telling them and take it away and share it.
So we mentioned in the opening, about how presentations can be too outdated or too technical, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how do you get away from that, especially if you're doing a presentation to raise funding or something to that effect, where
I've worked with a lot of clients, especially in the life sciences, tech industries, things like that, people who pitch to VCs.
yeah,
And they often have very technical stuff.
Yeah.
Now, their audiences as VCs, because not all VCs are science-based, not all VCs are tech-based. Some VCs have just got a hell of a lot of money. And it depends on what their background is as to what they're really going to understand. So
Yeah.
when you've got a group of those people mixed into your audience who potentially might fund whatever it is that you're trying to create,
sure,
you need to speak to a wider audience. Now, we all have emotions, right? We all
Yeah.
get charged up by emotions. You can always give your little packet with all your science and all that sort of stuff, but it's for people to read afterwards, or people can ask questions afterwards. The whole Q&A thing will come and have a meeting with you. So what you really want to focus on in that 7, 10, 15, 20-minute presentation that you have is, how do I charge up a bunch of VCs to get as excited about my product as I am, prove to them that it works, and get them more interested to ask questions. Because ultimately in that scenario, you want people to be like, hey, what about this? What about this? Even challenging you
yeah,
to say, well, I know this A, B, and C over here. So that starts conversation.
yeah. So essentially, you're enticing them to go into
Mm-hmm.
due diligence so that you can effectively get funded by them at some point.
Yeah, it's kind of like an
Yeah.
emotional commercial, if that makes any sense on a layman level.
Do you find that some CEOs do better because of their presentations are stronger in raising capital?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I've had the fortunate ability. Now, I can't say it was all because of me, but I have had people go to raise a certain amount of money and raise above that.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
So whether I had a hand in that or not, I don't know. But they
You can
said,
pat yourself on the back. It's
yeah,
okay,
yeah.
it
Well,
worked.
they've hired me again multiple times after the fact and referred me to other VCs, and I've worked with other people because of those scenarios.
Awesome. So, what components do you think make a great presentation?
There's a few. Well, if you're talking about having a presentation where you've got slides, your slides need to support your message, not be necessarily part of it, if that
Sure.
makes any sense. So if you have imagery, you want your images to be really bold, really bright, and really emotionally driven
Sure.
to match whatever it is you're saying. You also want them to be salient. Now, salient means that, you have a bold message that's maybe the 10% of your message that you really want people to take away.
Sure.
We're just using 10% because it's a nice number, because they're not going to remember 90%. They're only going to remember maybe 10, 12, 15. There's no specific statistic that says
Really,
exactly.
so like when you give a talk, you're really only going to try to get them to retain 10%.
Yeah, that would be nice. That would be, and it's
If you keep them that
yeah,
long.
if you can keep them that long.
Yeah.
But you also want to, whatever that 10% is, you want to repeat it in multiple different ways, because other people have different ways that they learn. Some are audible, some are visual,
Yeah.
some, but we're all emotional in the way we remember stuff. So that 10%, if you're very creative and clever, you can filter it through that you say it multiple different ways throughout the presentation, so it doesn't become boring. Like you're saying, the dog walked down the street, 10 times throughout the presentation. That's too literal. And then get creative with, you can use things like music, stimulate them with humor. Appropriate planned humor is exceptionally good. People say to me all the time, like, I'm not funny. How do you make people funny? And this is my belief and my experience.
And you do have a lot of experience with this because you're also a comedian. At
yeah,
one
I
point,
did
right?
comedy for 10 years. And I still write for my clients comedy and I still teach and coach in a comedic way.
Nice.
Because it gets people laughing and it relaxes them.
You make me laugh.
Well, I'm also a laughter yoga coach and trainer, so that's a whole new story. But let me finish
totally.
answering.
Okay, sorry. I derailed you.
Where were we? Wait a minute. We're talking about the 10%. So appropriate planned humor. Then I also mentioned that people think that they're not funny, but my belief is you are the funniest person you know, because there's not one person that's listening on this radio station right now who has not at some point made a friend, a neighbor, a family member laugh.
Yeah.
We laugh. 86% of what we laugh at is just communication. It's just the common denominator, the elephant in the room. I've experienced the same thing as you've experienced. Like, oh yeah, I know about the weather.
The irony, yeah.
So and a lot of the techniques that comedians use are really simple. They're really simple, and if you're willing to go there and use them, it's amazing what people can do with their own humor inside their own presentation.
Okay. Well, we're gonna have to take a quick break. I'm getting Paul, the engineer, who started us late. By the way, for all our listeners, it's Paul's fault, not Stephanie Paul Roberts. So we're talking to Stephanie Paul, communications trainer extraordinaire and CEO of Stephanie Paul Inc. We're gonna take a quick break, and when we come back, we're gonna talk about how to actually put all this together. Ooh. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Higher Power with Rick Girard, giving you access to recruiting techniques that will help you hire key talent to build your company towards real success. Rick is a recruiting executive and entrepreneur who's been successfully recruiting in the aggressive Silicon Valley technology landscape for the past 2 decades. After a very successful stint at Apogee, he founded Stride Search in 2012. Based on a lean efficiency model, Stride has uniquely positioned itself as a leader in retained search for the most critical talent hires within a small organization. Whether you're a startup executive or recruiting professional, by listening to Higher Power with Rick Girard, you will walk away with skills to help you attract and hire great talent. Now back to Higher Power with Rick Girard.
Welcome back to the Higher Power Radio Show. I'm your host, Rick Girard, and today our guest is the amazing Stephanie Paul, speaker, trainer, and CEO of Stephanie Paul Inc. Before the break, we laughed quite a bit. We discussed the importance and the elements that make a great presentation. We're going to continue with that, and then we're going to talk a little bit about how to put it all together for you. So we talked about the slides and the story. Next piece would be delivery, right?
I guess so, yeah. And I just want to reiterate on the story aspect of it. A story doesn't necessarily mean once upon a time and all the details. You can tell a story in a sentence.
Yeah.
So it's just what is the story that you need to tell, and how is it emotionally delivered, so that people can get excited about that story, whatever that is. And the delivery is really about pacing, pitch, learning pausing and timing and things like that, how to combat nervousness. And stay mindful of being in the moment versus like in your head with the script. Like I've literally had clients where I watch them go from their presentation into their head where they're reading their script, because that's where they've memorized it. Yeah. And I'll say to them, "Are you reading I'll stop them in the middle of rehearsal. You're reading your script right now," and they're like, "What are you talking about? I don't have my script in front of me." I'm like, "No, it's in your head." And because we memorize visually, everything we memorize is visually, but they happen to have visualized it in their head. And they're like, "Yeah, how could you see that?" I'm like, "Because I read behavior for a living."
It's what I do. Mm-hmm. All right. So from delivery, okay. So
practice.
Delivery, yeah. I mean, I would imagine repetition on the delivery is key. Mm-hmm. So how long does it take for somebody to actually internalize the content that they need to deliver?
I think it depends on the person. There are several different types of techniques that you can use. Like you could even just Google memorization techniques. There's like about 5 different like ones out there, but all of them involve some form of visual imagery.
Yeah.
And some of it's sound, music, whatever that is. I think that the easiest way for me is when you add your own story and your own imagery to it. It doesn't actually have to make sense. I mean, I could go into this and talk about this for an hour, but I don't want to get too deep in the weeds of it. But yeah, practice is important, and figuring out what are the key things that you need to hit. So in your brain, you want to bullet point those, and you want to memorize those.
Got it.
You can ad lib somewhat. It's really important that if you have a time restriction, because if you are respectful of the time, you're respectful of your audience. If your audience know that you're doing a 15-minute presentation, then you better well be doing a 14-minute presentation.
Yeah.
Because you give at least a minute for their reaction, their laughter, whatever that is.
Got it.
And you're very respectful. When people run over, everybody does this. Oh. Unless you're phenomenal. If you're phenomenal, then yeah, people don't mind so much. But how do we know that we're going to be phenomenal?
Exactly.
So practicing with a timer on always, so that you learn to clock yourself with time. And it is actually something that you will learn over time. Like that's why stand-up comedians can go, oh, you want me to do 5 minutes? Get up and do 5 minutes and get in and out there. And they don't even necessarily have to look at their watch. They know what 5 minutes feels like.
Really?
So all those kind of little tricks can really help with delivery. And just practice on the things that you know you're bad at. So the things that you have to drop. A lot of people say and and so. So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, it's like, what's the so there
I
for?
had an problem for a long time. I think I've broken it a bit.
If you're aware of it, you
But,
can get rid of it. Yeah.
All right. So any other components? I think you mentioned emotional content.
Emotional
and
content, yeah.
interaction as well.
And you also, if you expect your audience to get emotionally charged, you have to be there 100% yourself.
Yeah.
That's where mirror neurons come into play. You know, mirror neurons is like whatever's firing in your head is going to fire in your audience.
Got
if you are fully connected to what it is that you want to fire. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
You know, the emotional content piece, I think, too, is very transferable, especially when you're presenting. Or I'm going to rope this back into what we do. This is a show about hiring and finding talent. If you emotionally engage the person that you're trying to recruit and hire, you have a much greater chance of getting that person to join your company than you do if you just kind of question it, like interview them and question the whole time, right?
Oh, there's nothing worse than the job interview situation where there's a panel of people sitting opposite you and you're sitting there and, you know, it's like that desk is in between, you know, like it's just an awful situation.
Well, that was back in 1920, I think that one is.
I don't know.
I've never been a little bit.
I think I've only interviewed for a job once in my life, but
you're
auditioned.
Lucky.
No, I've auditioned a lot.
Yeah.
That's the same thing, though.
But an interview is an audition, yeah. That's the way I think of it as well. All right, so you have a process, right, in which you train people to give a great presentation? Can I share that process? Share that process with our audience?
Well, it's a little bit different for each individual or each team that I work with.
Okay.
It depends on where they're at.
Sure.
So I'll speak in front of a large audience, but I won't train a team more than 20 people at a time, 20 or less.
Okay.
Because I don't feel that they have a strong takeaway. I think ethically on my part, if I can't engage them and elevate them very quickly, then I haven't done my job.
Yeah.
So more than 20 people is a tough call to get that elevation to happen in a short space of time of like 1 or 2 days training.
Got it.
So what I normally do is I always interview. I interview people on the phone. I just get a sense of their personality. I like to know who's coming into the room. I like to know who I'm going to be working with, what their fears are, where they think their strengths are, their weaknesses. Is kind of like doing a job interview.
Yeah, totally.
It's exactly like what you do.
You're auditioning them.
But I'm auditioning them, but they're coming in to be my client.
Yeah.
what I find about that is it was incredibly frustrating for me as an actor, and every time I went to do a training or something like that, where we wasted the first hour of the class getting to know each other.
Oh, God.
And that's just a waste of time to me. I want to get in there and I want to learn and I want to whatever. So that interview process happens outside the training room.
Sure.
And then inside the training room, I already have everybody on
Point. You know
point
who
with
they
me.
are.
They're eating out of the palm of my hand, so to speak.
Yeah.
No, because we've talked, they're comfortable with me because they're about to go into a space where they have to be vulnerable.
Yeah.
And, you know, especially when you're talking with tech people, geeks, you know, science people, stuff like that, you know,
Being vulnerable is very uncomfortable.
very, very uncomfortable for those guys. But once
Yeah.
they have a bit of a joke with me, they find out that I'm not like, you know, I'm not going to be like tearing them down and stripping them apart. And, well, I sort of am, but at least they're comfortable with it. You know,
But you're doing it in a very nice way.
I do it in a I you know, they get to laugh at themselves, and when people can laugh at themselves, they're much more open about figuring out what that strong part of them is. I'm very good at reaching in and pulling out your best attributes as a presenter and
Got it.
knowing what works for you and what you should stay away from that.
You should not do comedy. Okay. So, what is the process that you run? Like, what would be your typical process that you could give to our audience that maybe would help them to structure or put together a presentation if they?
Well, let's just say, because I don't know what each audience member individually is wanting to do, so
Sure.
let's not talk about teams that I work with. Let's
Okay.
talk more about an individual. If you have a presentation and you need to put it together, first of all, you have to figure out what's your objective.
Mm-hmm.
What is the ultimate takeaway that you want your audience to take away? What is maybe the 3 things that at the end of it you want them to be absolutely 100% clear on and go, okay, this is what I'm working on. So is that a call to action? Is that something that that's a strong memory that makes them want to buy? Well, you know, I don't get
Yeah.
into the sales thing. I'm not a salesperson.
Yeah.
But so what is the ultimate goal of the presentation? And then sort of backtrack it to, well, what is your top 10% that you need to repeat through the presentation so that
Yeah.
it comes back and you do it in a different way, and so that the message comes across as a different stimuli, you know?
Well, there's typically a trend too where basically it's more of an education-based presentation as opposed to a sales-based presentation these days, right?
Yeah, those salespeople, they're like, just like, raise your hand and now you want to buy from me and raise
Yeah.
it. It's like, ooh.
Yeah. People run from that these
Yeah.
days. Okay.
But there's a lot of people still out there doing it, you know,
Yeah.
that 20-year-old presentation style. Yeah, you want to give a gift to your audience. I mean,
Yeah.
like, you know, the whole TED branding and TED format, they talk about the gift. What is that diamond, that gift that you want to give to the audience?
Yeah.
So I think that's really key. Then writing out, like, there's a great website, it's called Words to Minutes, I think it is, online, where you can actually, if you've got 15 minutes that you need to say, then, you know, figure out how many words that is. I think 15 minutes is about about 2,000 words, I think is 15 minutes
Oh, really?
off the top of my head. But, you know, figure out what that is, and then you want to cut it down. And then you want to rehearse it with your time clock, and figure out that you're hitting that section. You know, like I said, you want to come in 13 and a half, 14 minutes if you're doing a 15-minute presentation.
Okay.
And then you want to match your images up with your presentation or your videos or whatever that is. So your audience cannot multitask. They cannot listen to you and look at something at the same time. If you want them to read something, well, then read it along with them.
Got it.
A good interaction is having whatever it is having that in front of them and then getting them to read with you, getting someone from the audience to
So
read it
giving
out
a
loud.
handout or something.
Yeah,
different. Yeah.
or I mean, as long as it's
that
conducive.
engages them.
Yeah, as long as it's conducive with what you're doing.
Sure.
But there are lots of different things that you can get the audience to engage with you, so that you're not just talking at them.
Okay.
So there can be physical things, there can be, you know, answering questions, raise your hand, blah blah blah, all that kind of stuff, so that you have different stimuli throughout the presentation. You've got different imagery that supports what you're saying, that drives emotion.
Yeah.
Make sure that it's not specific, that you leave it open enough so that they're allowed to have their own interpretation of what it is that you're showing them, versus like, you know, the Nazi style of this is mandatory, you must feel and think this way. Because however you show, if you say this is my story and you show your story and you do it in a clever way, then the audience will see themselves in that story because they've probably had some form of experience that they can attach to it
Got
in
it.
their own life.
Got it.
And that's where the emotional connection starts happening.
So when you're forming that emotional connection? Are you kind of using shock and awe type?
Depends on what your content is, but
yeah.
yeah, it changes.
Okay. Well, let's just think of it in terms of presenting to a VC, right? What would be
You can't get too emotional, and
yeah.
You have to be able
It's
to.
a different type of
Yeah,
presentation.
and the emotions are there, but obviously you can't get too bleeding heart because the violins come out and everybody's like, oh my god, because VCs are just going to go, what is this BS?
Yeah.
But you do have to have an emotional component in there because especially with, like, let's say, the medical field, everyone in the world has had an experience pretty much. If you haven't, you're going to with cancer. Like it's kind of everyone has some form of connection to that.
Oh yeah.
So that's what you're talking about, is that your audience can sort of connect to their experience somehow. Let's say you're selling your product is something to do with cancer, or research, cancer and development. Anything.
Yeah.
So you have to figure out what that is, but on a very sort of corporate level but it still has to be there. It can't be too cold. It can't be too presentation style. There still has to be. So it's a delicate game, especially with VCs. Anyway.
Sure. I would imagine that the emotional part that they really want to see from a VC perspective is your passion for what you're doing.
Exactly. That's more what you drive.
Yeah. So in your passion and really your ability to follow through and make this thing, give them a return on their investment.
Exactly. Give us the stats, show us what you're doing, and if you're not passionate about it, why should I be? And that's any audience.
Yeah.
If you're not emotionally connected and driven and passionate and focus, like if you're just kind of delivering monotone and kind of like why should I get why should I get excited?
Like I do.
Yeah. No, you're not that bad. God.
I know. I need some coaching. So so let's kind of pull out the key takeaways that we can kind of give our audience that really, I know we're giving a lot of information in a short amount of time.
Yeah.
But, so understanding your stimulus.
Stimulus value, yeah.
Yeah, your value. So
what's that?
What is that?
What is your stimulus value? No, it's got nothing to do with something you buy from a store. It's... I know there's some people whose brains went that direction. No, stimulus value is a psychology term, and it basically means how do you stimulate me, and I decide what your value is. In layman's terms, it's how do you judge me, or how do I judge you based on what I see before me.
Sure.
And then what's in it for me is the value part of it. So a lot of people, I find, substantial amount of people that I work with, don't really understand how an audience sees them or how they come across.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important that that's something that people have to open up and be vulnerable to, because sometimes a lot of people don't come across
we
the way.
don't want to know, really.
But if you don't know how you come across, then you're going to be a bad communicator.
I totally agree with you, but
Yeah.
I think there's, you don't want to know that people think bad of you in some sort of way. It just is.
Most people,
part of human
especially
nature.
C-suite executives, most of their staff will lie to them about how bad they are.
Yeah.
So that's why peer groups like Critical Mass are fantastic, because your peers will tell you the truth.
You hear that, Rick Franzi? A plug for you on my show.
No, but that's why peer groups are great, because you're there with your own level C-suite execs, whatever that is, and they'll give you the honest feedback that you need. And if you want to improve, then you have to hear that, and that might be your physical appearance, the way you talk to people, the way you sort of. Some people can come across kind of scary, and if they come across kind of scary, not everybody's going to want to tell them, you come across kind of scary.
Yeah.
Or you don't come across empathetic, or whatever that is.
Exactly.
But that is a very key component to becoming a great presenter, is really understanding how do people see, perceive, and understand you when you walk in a room. Not when you start speaking, but when you walk into a room.
Ooh. So that's all nonverbal communication right there. How you walk into the room.
Mm-hmm.
So if you kind of had your shoulders and head down and you walk into a room like you're not a presence, then people are going to put you in that category.
Especially if you're giving a presentation.
Yeah.
The start of your presentation is the moment before.
Yeah.
It's not the presentation. It's not even walking on stage. It's the moment before. You need to be 100% on before you even walk into the room or get on stage. And there's a whole preparation aspect of how that is and what you need to do for the moment before.
All right, and that's going to probably be content for another show.
Yeah.
I'm getting the wrap it up from Paul over here. So we're just about out of time for today's show. You got me all flabbergasted.
What?
Because I'm thinking about all this stuff. You got me all psyched up.
Okay.
So, Stephanie, thanks again for your time investment here
Thanks,
on the
Rick.
Higher Power Radio Show today, and welcome to the Higher Power Radio Show community.
Yay!
Yay! Now, I am sure that some of our listeners are going to want to reach out to you for your expertise. How do they reach you and find out more?
The best way to reach me is probably SCP at AdvanceYour, which is .org. That's switching over to Stephanie Paul Inc. because I just got my trademark, so
Nice.
everything's switching over. But if you Google Stephanie Paul, literally
And spell Stephanie Paul if you could.
STEPHANIEPAUL.
Wow. And she rolls into sexy voice.
Yeah, with an American accent, of course.
Wow.
No, if you Google
Impressive.
that, my LinkedIn will pop up, my Facebook will pop up. My website is being built right now, which is stephaniepaulinc.com.
Okay.
So, but you can get my bio on there. It is live. It has something up there, but we just haven't finished building it yet because there's a lot of video content going in there.
Yeah, and I highly recommend, Stephanie, if you need coaching for presentations, I would reach out to her. If you guys don't, you're silly. So I want to thank our listening audience for tuning in to this week's episode of Higher Power. A quick thanks to our team, our engineer, Paul Roberts. He needs a couple of claps today. Our producers, Andrea Ballin, Shanti Ryle, and our executive producer, Kim Iverson. To listen to this show and any past episodes, you can check us out at Higher, that's Hire, powerradio.com, or Higher Power Radio on iTunes. Follow us on LinkedIn or Facebook at Higher Power Radio Show, or you can follow me on Twitter at Rick_Girard. So we have another great show lined up for you guys next week. Our guest will be Brian Anderson, the founder and CEO of Telecomprehensive Solutions. I'm your host, Rick Girard, and you have been listening to the Higher Power Radio Show. Aloha.
Aloha.
Thank you for listening to Higher Power with Rick Girard on OC Talk Radio.